So when we think about communities building youth future structure, we actually see two really distinct structural elements that are embedded in the collective impact approach. And what we've learned, at Tamarack over the last little while is that lots of communities use lots of different words for this. We think it's probably important, since we're starting with a number of new communities involved, that we kind of land on some language that is cohesive with all the communities that we're working on. So the two elements are the CBYF backbone and the larger community ecosystem. And so the backbone includes these things. It includes a 10 to 15-person leadership table, which also includes youth voice. We have a local charity, which is acting as the convener and fiscal sponsor of the leadership table, and they will hold the revenues on behalf of the collaborative work, and a small staff team that will help the work move forward. So that's the backbone. It's not just the staff team, it's actually the leadership, the core convener, and the staff. That makes the backbone. And then there's this larger ecosystem, a community-wide ecosystem, and this will be all of the components of the CBYF backbone, but it'll also include potentially working groups and action teams that might work on a topic area or a specific focus area. And then in the larger ecosystem, there will be other organizations, youth groups, nonprofits, and we'll show this in a visual way in a few minutes. If we can move to the next slide. So what we've tried to do in this slide is to kind of break down the 5 core elements of the collective impact structure, give you a little bit of detail around the primary focus and contributions of each of those elements, and a little bit around time commitment. We know that this is, this is going to be different for different communities, but it at least gives you a sense of, contributions or expectations around time. And so each of these has kind of core elements to it, and we'll continue later in the slide deck to go over these again, but you can see in a kind of one slide how it all fits together. The blue elements are the backbone elements, the green elements are that larger community ecosystem that we've been talking about. Okay, next slide. So when you're thinking about pulling together a leadership table at your community level, here are the things that you want to be thinking about for the leadership table focus. And they should be, the individuals that you draw around the leadership table should be recognized by their peers as someone who can contribute to this work. They should be knowledgeable about the subject area around communities building youth futures, should be action-oriented thinkers. They should be able to represent their organization, bring that perspective to the table. You want to have diversity of perspectives around the table, and having youth at the table is really important. Tamarack has learned in our work with cities reducing poverty that when we're trying to move community change forward, having the voice of lived and living experience, and in this case with communities building youth futures, having the voice of youth is really critical to this work. Next slide. So leadership table should also have these member gifts, right? And so these would be things that, are maybe a little bit less tangible than the attributes. And so they could be things like people who are connectors, people who know other people across the system, they're attractors. So someone others might want to have in the room, that they have the ability to see the ecosystem and are the ecosystem, and so they have some larger scale vision, they have subject matter or content expertise, and the staff provides support to the leadership table as well as support to the working groups. And so while the staff wouldn't necessarily have voting abilities at the leadership table, they are providing the support to the leadership table. Next slide. So we're going to show you a model that has been used by a number of groups that in Canada that have worked in a kind of collective impact way. This is called the constellation model. The idea behind the constellation model was developed by the Centre for Social Innovation in Ontario. Basically, the big idea is that it's a horizontal model versus a vertical model, and it really is about engaging multiple groups and multiple sectors together to work on a shared outcome. So next slide. So this is actually a really nice visual of this model. And it fits really well with a collective impact approach. So on the one side of the model, you can see kind of the backbone infrastructure. So there's a leadership table with a convener and fiscal sponsor as a member of the leadership table, and backbone staff. And that group, that backbone group altogether, provides the strategic guidance and support to the overall collective impact initiative. And then you have your ecosystem of community partners, and they're really the groups that are moving forward from the perspective of building better youth futures. And so there might be community partners that are joined to an action team or a working group. And then there might be other community partners that are nonprofits or businesses or public agencies, government, residents that are doing work for youth in the community, but might not necessarily be affiliated with an action team or a working group. And so it's interesting to think about this this approach for collective impact kind of work, because it's not only saying that the work sits within, you know, the backbone infrastructure. In fact, the work, the Communities Building Youth Futures work encompasses all of this. It encompasses the backbone infrastructure, but it also encompasses this larger ecosystem, because the more you can identify who's out there in the ecosystem, the more you might have opportunities to leverage that change moving forward. Next slide. So here's an example of a slightly different model. We're going to give you a couple of examples because we know that in a variety of different communities, there might be different ways that this expresses itself. So this is an alternative. This might be some of your communities, some that we've seen already, where there might be a larger collective impact initiative already going on in the community, and the CBYF, the Communities Building Youth Futures, joins on to that, a larger collective impact initiative. And so you can see that around the leadership table, there's green and purple circles. And so that says that, you know, these two initiatives are joined together, and there might be a host organization, a convener that takes care of both the larger collective impact initiative, but also is the convener and host organization for the Communities Building Youth Futures. In the case, in this example, there might be action teams that are specifically related to Communities Building Youth Futures, and then there might be action teams that are related to some of the other collective impact work that is going on in the community, some of the other priorities that the larger collective impact initiative might have identified. And you can see in the staffing structure, there might be some collective impact backbone staff, and then particular staff that are really focused on moving forward the Communities Building Youth Futures initiative. So we've seen that this might apply to some of the communities, some of the 13 communities have already expressed interest in this initiative. Another example for the next slide is kind of alternative B. And so alternative B, so alternative B has these two collective impact initiatives going on in a community, but the one collective impact initiative is on its own and has a different fiscal sponsor and convener than the Communities Building Futures fiscal sponsor and convener, but they all sit at the collective impact leadership table, right? And so again, we have different action teams and working groups. And this is where different funding comes into the community for different types of collective impact kind of work. There might be a table on housing and homelessness. There might be a table on building youth futures. There might be a collective impact table on poverty reduction. They're all sitting at this shared leadership table. Not in small to medium-sized communities, you don't want to have multiple tables. You actually want to synergize as much as possible the work that you're in community. So you might have this overarching collective impact leadership table with these sub-tables that are happening in the community as well. So just another way of looking at the structure. We're not suggesting that the first model, alternative A or alternative B, are the right ones. What we're suggesting is what's going to work in your context. What we are suggesting is this kind of approach to understanding not only the backbone infrastructure as being both leadership table, the fiscal sponsor convener, and the staffing, and then this larger ecosystem of community change partners or community partners in helping to move the work forward. And so those are just designs that we think are helpful and kind of core areas of core elements in the work. We think about how this work might unfold in your community and what the structure might look like. If we go to the next slide. So for the constellation model, there are kind of three primary elements. The constellation model would use the word stewardship group, constellations, and third-party coordination. In the case of the CBYF, we are talking about the stewardship being the CBYF leadership table. The constellations are the working groups or action teams, and third-party coordination is the role of the convener, fiscal sponsor, and the CBYF staff team. And they also, in the constellation model, suggest that there should be three kind of core documents. One is the guiding principles, one is kind of the governance terms of reference, and the third is the strategic plan. We would say, yes, guiding principles are critical to this work. The governance terms of reference is helpful for both the leadership table and for the working groups or action teams. In the case of the CBYF, the strategic plan is really the common agenda and core strategies that the communities building youth futures groups will be designing for their communities. Next slide. So the next couple of slides really go into a little bit more detail around what this might look like, right? And so we're going to start with the CBYF backbone infrastructure. And so you can see this is everything in this red box. It's the convener and fiscal sponsor, the leadership table, and the communities building youth futures backbone staff team. And so we think of all of that as the infrastructure, the backbone infrastructure. It really, the main goals are that they would monitor the overall health of the communities building youth futures initiative, that they're going to have a direct relationship with the working groups, and making sure that the working groups, the constellations, the working groups, the action teams, are trying to move the overall common agenda forward, and they provide support to the action teams or the constellations in this model. We move to the next slide. This is the ecosystem of community partners, and in the communities building youth futures ecosystem, we would have working groups or action teams, and there would be other organizations which are supporting and serving youth in your community. The working groups and action teams, specific activities that they're going to be undertaking. So you might in your community say, hey, you know, our community is really interested in advancing opportunities for youth in the trades in our community. This was one of the issues we chatted about in Yellowknife. So opportunities for youth in the trades. So you might have an action team or a working group that you focus on that really kind of dives deep into advancing opportunities for youth in the trades. And it would be an action group that would have, you know, folks from the different trades involved. It might have youth involved. It might have your local community college involved. So the key people that would be around that action area those are the people that you'd want to have around that table. And usually what happens is the chair of the action team is often affiliated with the leadership table. So there is a connection between the action team, the working group, and the leadership, a larger CBYF leadership table. Next slide. So what are some elements of success in this constellation model? It's that you don't, that it is a more flexible and adaptable model. So while we believe it's important to have terms of reference and values and principles for moving forward, we think they should weight in design, and we're happy to share with you some of these that have been designed for the Cities Reducing Poverty initiative, that there are these action focused teams that really are moving the work of the action focused teams has to be done in parallel with the common agenda and really are advancing specific elements of the common agenda forward, and that there is staff support both for the leadership table and for the work of the action teams. Some of the advantages are that they're able to respond to opportunities, that there is flexibility and adaptability within this kind of design. Next slide. Some of the challenges in this model are that things are moving quite fast at times, and so you've got to really make sure that things are in sync, right? That the work of the action groups is in sync with, you know, the vision of the leadership table and the overall backbone infrastructure, that the action and working groups don't go madly off in all directions, that there is this alignment. So we want to talk about the key elements of this infrastructure. So if we go forward, we can just jump right to the next slide. So in terms of this, we often draw on this quote from our colleague Jay Connor, who says that it's kind of like when you build a house, right? You want to make sure that you have a manager on the construction site who really looks at the whole building, while we have many people that are working on their specific piece. And so the backbone infrastructure is really like that big old management function for this work. Go to the next slide. So the backbone infrastructure has kind of 6 core functions that it looks at. It guides the vision and strategy. It really takes responsibility for understanding measurement and progress as the measurement and progress is being made. So they're really, they play a pretty important role in terms of reporting to Tamarack and to the Communities Building Youth Futures initiative about how progress is being made and being part of the overall evaluation. They establish measurement practices. There's opportunities for the backbone to really think about, okay, so how do we communicate to, you know, both the people that are involved in our action teams and working groups, but how do we talk to that whole ecosystem of community about what they're seeing happening in that larger ecosystem, and how do we understand that, and how does that inform our common agenda and our ability to move forward? They advance policy opportunities if those appear, and they mobilize funding. And so they look at the kind of core budget for the infrastructure and determine how that budget might be spent and whether there's a need for additional resources or additional ways that partners might be able to be engaged to move the work forward. Next slide. So one of the things you want to look for in the infrastructure, the backbone infrastructure, are people that are visionary, that have a results-oriented kind of perspective, that are collaborative and relationship builders, that can be both focused and adaptive, that have good communication skills, etc. And I always like, when I look at this slide, I think to myself, oh my goodness, that's hard to find in one person. Well, the good news is that you have multiple people sitting around your leadership table and multiple people that will be involved in your backbone staff team. So I don't ever think about this as one person, but I think this is the kind of skill set that we want to bring into our overall backbone infrastructure, because really the backbone infrastructure, the leadership table and the staff and the convener, you're really stewarding the Communities Building Youth Futures initiative forward. And so having these kinds of perspectives around the table is very helpful. Next slide. You also want to think about equity in your backbone infrastructure approach. And so this is really important to consider, you know, how we have youth voice engaged in this work. And so can we, you know, to what degree do we have youth sitting around our leadership table? To what degree are we going to have youth hired to be part of our backbone staffing team? You know, to what degree are the organizations, the partners that we have around the leadership table, to what degree do they also engage youth in the work? And so these are some of the questions that you want to be asking for the components, all of the components that are involved in the backbone infrastructure part of this work. Next slide. So here are now we're going to go into a little bit more detail around the key players. I'm not going to go into these slides in a lot of detail, but you will get the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to take a look at them and you'll be able to say, hey, yeah, this works for me, or I might shift this a little bit given my local context. We know that each of you are unique and that these are high-level guidelines for thinking about this work and then adapting them to the context that works in your community. Okay, so let's go to the next. So in each case, you can see we're going to land again on this this kind of model. In each case, we're going to pull one element out, talk about it in more detail. So next slide. So this is about the convener, fiscal sponsor. The purpose is that they're a Canadian charity, that they have a mandate or a mission that's aligned. So there should be engaged in some connection to building youth futures, either a really strong interest or already an organization that's working in that area. They're going to hold the financial and legal accountability. They can provide administrative services, which can either be in kind or would be included as a fee as part of the budget, and that's an expense that will be an acceptable expense. They're typically a well-established, trusted, and respected organization, and sometimes they will sit at the leadership table, but the staff will not be voting. Only business sponsor will have the ability to be a voting member of the leadership table. Next slide. The leadership table, so we've already talked a lot about this, 10 to 15 members, should reflect multiple sectors, initially meets on a monthly basis, and they provide the overall leadership and strategic guidance to the common agenda and the collective impact work. Next slide. Project manager. So on your backbone staff team, you might have a lead person, right? A director, a project manager. This is typically what we see in collective impact work. And so they're the kind of lead staff person. And you can see some of the roles on this slide of what they might play. They're accountable to the entire collaborative initiative via the leadership table. Next slide. Then there might be a staff team of 1 to 3 people. They might be project organizers. It really depends, I mean, on your community and your community context. 3 people might be too big for your community, or it might be just right. And so we're leaving it up to the individual community to determine how many staff are really required to move the collective impact work forward. But we would suggest anywhere from 1 to 3 staff is about the right size. Next slide. The action teams, working groups, we haven't landed on one name here, so we're using both, but you can see that the action team is not a single existing organization, but rather a collaborative of groups. They're coordinated across teams. It can be time limited, or they can be ongoing. So you might have an action team that says, you know, for the next 6 months, we really want to focus on this piece of the work. And so at the end of 6 months, that action team has completed their work and they can drop out. Some action teams might be longer term in nature, might actually run for the entire length of the project. I noticed that I have to fix something on this slide, which when you get the new slides, you will get an upgraded version of the action teams, because this was taken from another presentation, and it says that they're content experts, patients, caregivers, and community. That actually should read diverse membership of content experts, youth, and community. So we'll take out the patients and caregivers. Next slide. The broader community or the ecosystem. So these are those circles on this picture that are not necessarily connected to the action teams. And those circles are other groups in the community who, you know, might not be willing to sit on an action team at the moment, or might not be needed on an action team at the moment, but are groups that are engaging youth in different ways. Might be sports groups, it might be social clubs, but they exist in the broader ecosystem, and you might draw them in, or you might get them engaged in kind of being informed in the work or providing feedback to the work. And so it's important to, in your early days of your collective impact work, to really map the larger ecosystem and then identify who is on your action teams and working groups and who's on the leadership table, so that you get a good sense of the whole community in terms of its connection to communities building youth futures. Next slide. So some of the things that you want to think about beyond the structure is really to think about, okay, so if we are going to bring people onto our leadership table, our backbone staff team, or our working groups, what are the kind of characteristics that would be helpful to us? What kind of decision making do we want to engage in? Are we going to work by consensus? Is it majority vote? What does that look like? Where does the authority lie? Who has ultimate responsibility for making decisions? How are we going to communicate with each other? What kind of leadership styles are we looking for? What's the culture of our communities building youth futures initiative? Do we want to be, you know, process light or process heavy? We would maybe suggest being more on the process light side. And then what are the arrangements? So how many action teams are we going to support? How many people will sit on action teams? How many people around our leadership table? So those are some of the conversations that you want to be having. And some of them are related to structure, but they actually take you even beyond structure in some cases.